Welcome, everyone. I want to start off by sending a very warm, divine blessing out to you for your day and, well, for your entire week ahead.
Yeah, absolutely.
We are so glad you're joining us today because you're in for something truly spectacular. Today, we're taking a deep dive into Exodus chapter 12.
The big one.
The big one, exactly. We're focusing on the institution of the very first Passover, the terrifying 10th plague, and that earth-shaking exit of the Israelites from Egypt.
It really is an earth-shaking moment in the biblical narrative. I mean, it changes everything.
It absolutely does. And to help us really unpack all of this, we're pulling insights directly from the study notes of two deeply researched texts today, the Holman Study Bible and the NAA Study Bible.
Excellent sources.
Right. And our mission today is to figure out exactly what was happening behind the scenes of this pivotal chapter.
And we really need to set the stakes right out of the gate here. Because this isn't just, it's not just some historical event to mentally catalog away, you know.
No, not at all.
We're looking at the literal birth of a nation's identity. If we connect this to the bigger picture of the ancient Near East, we're watching a story unfold about a massive, unprecedented transfer of wealth.
Oh, yeah.
The invention of, well, a very specific kind of ancient fast food. And a supreme, totally devastating judgment against an entire pantheon of Egyptian gods.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting right at the beginning of the chapter. Because the very first instruction God gives them, it isn't about packing their bags or gathering weapons. It's a calendar change.
Yeah, which is so counterintuitive.
Right. I was looking at the Holman notes on Exodus 12.2, and God actually resets their entire calendar. The month there in which the notes mention was known as Abub in Canaanite, or Nisan in Babylonian. God tells them, this month is now the first month of the year for you.
Yeah.
Why start there? It feels like an odd priority when you're literally about to flee a hostile empire.
Well, what's fascinating here is the psychological and the cultural reset that represents. If you think about the mindset of an enslaved people, their time hasn't belonged to them for generations.
It belonged to Pharaoh.
Exactly, it belonged to Pharaoh. Their years were measured by the reigns of their oppressors and just that endless, brutal cycle of making bricks.
Wow.
So by resetting the calendar, God is essentially making this massive declaration. He's saying, your true history as a free people starts exactly right now.
It's like a cosmic factory reset for an entire population.
That is a great way to put it. The NAA study notes emphasize that the events of the plagues and the Exodus, they're so foundational for the identity of Israel as this emerging nation that the very month they leave becomes month number 1.
It just completely severs their connection to the Egyptian way of keeping time.
Completely severs it, yeah.
And right after he resets time, he gives them the ultimate preparation instructions. So on the 10th day of this brand new first month, every household is told to select a lamb.
A very specific kind of lamb.
Right, but they don't sacrifice it right away. They have to keep it until the 14th day.
Right.
So what exactly does this 4-day waiting period accomplish?
From a practical standpoint, keeping the lamb for 4 days allowed the family to thoroughly inspect the animal. The instructions were strict, a year-old male with absolutely no defects.
Right, it had to be perfect.
But the NAA notes highlight a much deeper theological layer here too. And that is the profound substitutionary element. One unblemished life is going to represent the lives of the entire household when the judgment sweeps through the land.
And there's this really compelling communal aspect to this preparation, too.
Oh, absolutely.
The NAA notes point out that if a family was too small to consume a whole lamb, they were instructed to share with their nearest neighbor. They had to actually calculate the number of people needed to finish the meal.
Yeah, you couldn't just waste it.
Right. So before they even step foot out of Egypt, they're forming this ancient neighborhood watch. They're sharing resources. God is basically forcing them to interact and establish this profound sense of community. They're acting like a unified nation before they've even left their houses.
Which is brilliant because they are going to need that deep communal reliance for the wilderness journey ahead. They're learning to depend on each other and on Yahweh simultaneously.
So they have the calendar, they have the lamb, but the actual dinner instructions are where things get incredibly specific. This brings us to what we could arguably call the original fast food.
The original fast food, yeah.
The lamb must be roasted over a fire, specifically not eaten raw or boiled in water. It has to be eaten with bitter herbs, and it must be consumed with unleavened bread, or matzah.
And every single item on that menu is just dripping with symbolism that they were meant to carry forward.
Right.
The bitter herbs, they're a visceral, physical reminder of the bitterness of their slavery. It's a taste they're meant to remember, so they never take their freedom for granted.
And because they didn't have time for the dough to rise, the unleavened bread was, just a practical necessity. But what really fascinates me is how the NWA notes trace the evolution of that symbol.
Oh, the leaven, yes.
Yeah. A rushed baking job eventually turns into a permanent theological symbol for purity.
It's a profound shift.
Yeah.
The NAA notes reveal that in future observances of the Passover, eating anything with leaven during the festival of unleavened bread would be seen as a grave sin.
Wow.
Leaven becomes a symbol of corruption, of breaking the covenant. To intentionally eat leaven during the sacred time would represent a rejection of the Lord's founding of the nation. It became a sign of despising the very act that freed them.
It really elevates the stakes of the meal. And it wasn't just what they ate either, it was their posture while eating it. They had to eat with their loins girded, sandals on their feet, and their walking staff in their hand.
Dressed to flee.
Literally dressed to flee at a moment's notice. But obviously, the most crucial instruction happens outside the house, at the door frames.
Yes, the blood on the doorposts and the lintel.
The NAA notes give us a great practical detail here about how they actually applied it. They used a bunch of hyssop, which essentially acted as a thick, bushy paintbrush to smear the blood. It's a very visceral, messy act of obedience.
And this brings us to the core concept of the event, the Hebrew word Pesach,
which we translate as Passover.
Exactly. The Holman notes explain that this word conveys the idea of passing over or sparing. The blood was a visible, undeniable sign that distinguished God's people from the Egyptians. When the judgment came through the land, that blood was the signal for the judgment to just pass over that specific home.
The Holman notes also clarify something about the nature of that judgment that is genuinely terrifying. The text mentions a figure called the Destroyer. To a modern reader, that sounds like a rogue demon or some independent entity of chaos.
That is a very common misconception. But the Holman notes are careful to correct it. This destroyer isn't an independent evil force acting on its own.
Right.
This was a direct agent of God's sovereign judgment. It was carrying out a divine mandate, executing a terrifying but completely sovereign act of justice against an empire that had brutally oppressed and murdered people for centuries.
It's a very sobering reminder of the severity of divine justice.
It really is.
Which brings us to the 10th plague itself, and the devastation described here is absolute. At midnight, every single firstborn in the land of Egypt dies, from the absolute top of the social pyramid to the very bottom.
The Holman notes emphasize the stark contrast in Exodus 12.29. The death spanned from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne, all the way down to the firstborn of the captive who was sitting in the dungeon.
Unbelievable.
Nobody in the Egyptian system was exempt. It was universal devastation across their entire society.
But looking at the historical context provided in our research, this wasn't just a judgment on the people, was it?
No.
Both the Holman and NAA sources emphasize a critical theological point here about the Egyptian pantheon.
This is where the narrative operates on multiple levels. This is a supreme, definitive judgment on the gods of Egypt. As anyone familiar with ancient Egyptian culture knows, Pharaoh wasn't just a king, he was considered the literal incarnation of deity. He was responsible for maintaining Mahat, or cosmic order. The previous plagues had systematically dismantled the domains of specific Egyptian gods, the river, the sky, the crops.
But this final plague targets the very future of the nation and the supposed divine lineage of Pharaoh himself.
Precisely. It was Yahweh proving his infinite, unique power over every system of belief in Egypt. The God of the Israelites was showing that he alone, not Pharaoh, held the power of life and death.
And that Pharaoh's supposed divine protection was completely powerless.
Completely.
The psychological toll that must have taken on Pharaoh is just staggering. I read a detail in the Holman text that absolutely blew my mind. After the plague strikes, it's the middle of the night, there is a great cry in Egypt. Pharaoh summons Moses and Aaron. He tells them to get up and leave, take their flocks, take everything. But then he says something unimaginable. The Holman notes point out that Pharaoh actually asks Moses to bless him.
It is an unbelievable moment of irony. Total role reversal. Think of the arrogance of Pharaoh earlier in the Exodus narrative.
Right.
Sneering at Moses and asking, "Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice?"
Yeah.
And now he is completely broken. He's sending his slave workforce away, and as they walk out the door, the supposed living God of Egypt is begging their leader for a blessing from Yahweh.
It highlights the absolute, total collapse of the Egyptian power structure.
It's a complete paradigm shift.
And that collapse isn't just spiritual or political. It's profoundly economic.
Yeah.
Because as they leave, the Israelites do something that, reading this through a modern lens, sounds highly controversial.
Plunder.
Yes. They go to their Egyptian neighbors and ask for articles of silver, gold, and clothing. And the Egyptians just hand it over.
Yeah.
The text explicitly says they plundered the Egyptians.
So wait, isn't this basically looting? Asking your neighbors for their jewelry and then skipping town forever sounds a lot like theft. How do the scholars justify this?
It's a really great question, and the NAA notes provide some vital context that changes the entire perspective on this. This wasn't a robbery. This was the fulfillment of a centuries-old prophecy. Hundreds of years earlier, God made a covenant promise to Abraham in Genesis 15.1 time.
Ah, right.
He told Abraham that his descendants would be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years, but that God would judge the nation that enslaved them, and afterward they would come out with great possessions.
So this moment was written into their history before they even existed as a nation.
Exactly. It was a divine transfer of wealth.
Mm-hmm.
And the Holman notes frame it in a really interesting way. This was essentially God enforcing the payment of back wages.
That makes so much sense.
These people had provided free, brutalized slave labor to the Egyptian empire for centuries, building their massive store cities. The Egyptians were so terrified by the plagues, so eager to get the Israelites out of their land to stop the death, that they freely handed over their valuables.
Wow.
It was an ironic, divine payment for years of suffering, perfectly balancing the scales of justice.
So they have their new calendar. They've survived the midnight judgment under the blood of the Lamb. They are dressed and ready. And now they are loaded down with the wealth of Egypt.
It's time to move.
It is time to move. The Exodus begins. Let's talk about the logistics of this, because the sheer scale of this movement is hard to wrap your head around. They travel from Ramses to Sukkoth, and the text counts 600,000 men on foot.
And we have to remember, that number only accounts for the men.
Right. The NAA notes do the math for us here. When Jacob's family originally went down to Egypt to escape a famine 430 years prior, there were only 70 people.
Just 70.
Now, if you have 600,000 men, plus women, plus children, historians estimate we're looking at a migrating nation of roughly 2 million people.
2 million.
Imagine trying to coordinate a family road trip, but it's 2 million people, a bunch of livestock, and you don't even have a U-Haul. The logistics alone are a miracle.
The organizational feat of 2 million people walking out of a country overnight is staggering. It speaks to the absolute sovereignty of God orchestrating this departure.
But out of all the numbers and details of the departure, there is one specific phrase that caught my eye, and it totally reframes how we usually picture this event. Exodus 12.38 says they didn't leave alone.
A very crucial detail.
It says a mixed multitude went up with them. Who exactly was this mixed multitude?
The Holman and NDA notes both weigh in heavily on this, and it completely changes how we view the Exodus. It wasn't just ethnic Israelites who left.
Okay.
This mixed multitude was likely made up of other marginalized foreign slaves who saw a chance for freedom. It probably included some opportunists, but most importantly, it included Egyptians.
Let me play devil's advocate for a second here. Why would an Egyptian citizen look at this mass of slaves heading into a barren wilderness and decide to join them?
Think about what the average Egyptian citizen had just witnessed over the last year. They watched their economy systematically destroyed, their invincible gods humiliated, their agriculture ruined, and their pharaoh broken.
Yeah, that's true.
Many of them must have had a profound paradigm shift, realizing that Yahweh, the God of the Israelites, was the one true God. So when the Israelites marched out, these Egyptians packed their bags and joined the very people they used to enslave.
That is incredible. It's a beautiful picture of God's mercy extending far beyond the ethnic boundaries of Israel. Even in the midst of this terrifying national judgment, God was making a way of escape for anyone, even an oppressor, who wanted to align themselves with him.
And you see that inclusivity permanently codified in the rules God sets up for future Passover memorials at the end of the chapter.
Right.
Exodus 12.43 through 49 gives strict guidelines about who can eat the Passover in the future. God explicitly says that foreigners and aliens living among them are allowed to participate, but with one absolute condition. The males had to be circumcised first.
Showing that inclusion in the community of God was based on covenant loyalty, not DNA.
That's the crucial piece. By being circumcised, a foreigner was saying, I am fully committing to the covenant of Yahweh. I am leaving my old gods behind.
Yeah.
Once they made that commitment, the law mandated that they were to be treated exactly like a native-born Israelite. There weren't two tiers of citizenship in God's eyes. The rules applied equally to everyone who stepped under the covenant.
That is such a powerful precedent to set on day one of their new nation. And before we wrap up, there's one other highly specific rule at the end of the chapter that the NAA notes bring up.
Yes, the bones.
Right, which bridges this ancient story to the New Testament in a stunning way. When eating the Passover lamb, God commands them, do not break any of its bones.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of the entire biblical narrative, that tiny anatomical detail is explosive.
Completely.
The NAA notes point out that this is a direct prophetic parallel to the crucifixion of Jesus. In the Gospel of John, chapter 19, verse 36, Jesus is on the cross. The Roman soldiers come to break the legs of the crucified men to speed up their deaths, a standard, brutal Roman practice.
Right.
But when they get to Jesus, they see he's already dead, so they don't break his legs.
And Jared explicitly notes that this happened to fulfill the scripture.
Yes. John writes that this happened so that the scripture would be fulfilled, not one of his bones will be broken. The scholars over at the NAA are showing us that the very specific instructions for the Passover Lamb in Exodus 12 were always pointing forward.
Across centuries.
Across centuries to the ultimate perfect sacrifice of Christ.
It really ties the whole narrative together in such a profound, goosebump-inducing way. So to summarize this incredible journey we've taken today, we started with a group of brutalized, oppressed slaves.
Yeah.
Over the course of a single, terrifying, miraculous night, their entire reality is transformed. They are given a new calendar to mark the beginning of their freedom. They are given the wealth of the superpower that enslaved them, fulfilling a centuries-old promise.
A new identity.
Exactly. And most importantly, through the blood of the Passover Lamb, they are given a brand new identity as the redeemed people of God.
And that idea of identity is really what I hope you, listening right now, take away from this. Because God was very intentional about how this event was to be remembered.
Right.
He told them to observe this festival forever. When their children would ask in the future, what does this ceremony mean to you? They were to tell the story of the rescue. It makes you consider how memory, how rituals, and how the stories we deliberately choose to pass down shape our own identities today.
The Passover was designed to anchor a people in the memory of their deliverance so they would never, ever forget who they were and who saved them.
It's a potent reminder that we are shaped by the stories we remember. And I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over based on our deep dive today.
Please do.
Think about that mixed multitude we talked about. The requirement for deliverance wasn't having the right ethnic pedigree. It wasn't about where you came from or what your history was.
Right.
It was simply being willing to step under the blood on the doorpost. What does that tell us about who is truly invited into the ultimate escape?
That is a brilliant question to leave off on. Who is truly invited? Something for all of us to seriously think about in our own lives. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into Exodus 12.
It's been great.
It has been an absolute pleasure walking through this rich history with you. Until next time, God blesses all the listeners.